You've decided you want to get into modding Space Engineers, but you're not sure where to begin after getting all the programs you need. Well, fortunately for you, the first task is easy, but it is vital in making sure things work smoothly and properly. What you need to do is set up a projects folder. This folder, in short, is where we will store most all of our source files, and the structure of this is actually important. When it comes to video games, many small details matter, and if you mess one up, the whole thing can break. Fortunately for you, you don't have to guess what to do. Just follow this setup video and you'll have a working projects folder, hopefully, by the end. The first thing we need to do is actually open up Windows Explorer, and you need to decide where you want to actually put this folder of yours. For me, I'm going to put it on my storage drive, and you can see that I already have a 3D projects folder. I'm going to go ahead and use this since it has a whole bunch of working examples in it already. I'm going to go ahead and open it, and here you can see some folders. The only one that you don't need to worry about is the YouTube folder. What you need to do is create 3 folders. The first one will be Blender plugins, the next one is renders, and then the last one is Space Engineers. The Blender plugins folder is where we'll be installing some plugins for Blender that will allow us to actually use Blender easily for modding Space Engineers. There will be a future video that covers that, since it's a little bit more extensive than what I want to put in this video. The next one is the renders folder. This is where, whenever you render an image in Blender, it'll export here so you can always find out where it is at. From here is the Space Engineers folder, and this is the important folder we're talking about right now after you create all 3 of these. So once you go into this folder, you can see some files and you can see some folders. What I want you to do is create 2 folders, models and textures. Both of these folders and their structures are important. What we're making use of is something called relative pathing. This means that you do not need the full path of a file, instead you get its relative path to something. In essence, you could think of this folder with the blend files as the root folder of the mod you're creating. The importance of this is that not everyone has the same file structure as you, so you can not use absolute pathing. The models folder is the base models folder for a mod. Inside this folder will be the files and folders that make up our model physically. Ideally, you'll structure the inside of this to be understandable and to keep separate styles, themes, and functions all organized. Going inside the models folder, we'll see a whole bunch of folders and some files. Ideally, you won't see any files in here, as I find it to be sloppy and that you can run into issues if you're putting a whole bunch of files in here. It can make separating things very difficult, and I generally do not suggest putting the file export to this base folder. Instead, I highly suggest you put it into a separate folder to further separate it from what it is you're working on and what you might be working on in the future. For example, I'll go into the laser drill. In here, you can see a whole bunch of different file types. If I sort by type, we'll get a better idea of what we're looking at. These first set of objects are Fbx files. These are the mesh files that actually make our model look the way it does. The next is the Mwm file. This is the file we get when we combine the Fbx, the HKTs, and the XMLs all together to get something that Space Engineers uses. Going down further, we can see a whole bunch of text files. One type is just a general text file, and the other is an XML. The text files generally are not useful to us at all, as they contain information for the plugin to work properly, so you generally won't be going inside of these to find out anything. After these text files are the XMLs, and there's a few different ones here, but they all look like they're the same thing. The 2 important differences is that one is a block definition, which you could tell by the .blockdef afterwards, and then the others are actual model files that we could use to make the MWMs. Now, this block definition file contains some really nice information that's a lot easier thanks to the plugin. For example, it contains the mirroring, the mount points, and the block size and some other little bits that you may not actually end up using, but the mirroring and the mount points are the most important part. Now, before we go ahead and leave the models folder, Let's go ahead and set it up so we are sure we're opening up the XML documents with Notepad++ so that we can view it in a nicer environment. Remember, all you have to do is right-click, go to Open With, choose another app, tell it to always open up with Notepad++, and then you click OK. Here you can see some of the information I was talking about. Here it's saying the subtype ID, the icon which you're able to assign, the cube size, the type of block it is, how large the block is, the model offset, the model that it's linking to. Here you can see that it's followed by the Mwm file type, and then the block pair name. What you don't see is any mount point information. It's because this block doesn't actually use any mount point information because it's a large cube and it's mountable on all sides. So you don't need to include any mount point information, and it'll automatically be mountable on all of the sides. Going back to the laser drill folder, you can now see that our file has the Notepad++ icon, so it's going to be a little bit easier to identify what it is we're looking at. We're going to go ahead and leave the text document as the normal Notepad file type so that we can see the separation easily. That pretty much sums up the models folder, so let's go ahead and go back again, and here we are back in the root folder. Going inside the textures, we're greeted by just a models folder. The reason for this is that we're following the vanilla path for the textures so that we don't run into any issues such as purple or pink textures in-game. Going into the models folder again, we can see that it's specifically stating cubes. The reason for this is that they want to keep all the different pieces separate. So the cubes are actually the placeable objects that make ships. Going into this cubes folder, we can see a whole bunch of textures. These have all been converted into PNGs so I could view them inside Blender. Now, you don't have to do this, but I suggest doing it. I will provide a zip later on containing all of these PNGs so it's easier for you to access them and use them directly. The reason I only have the PNGs in here instead of the DDS files is because I'm not actually adding the DDS files to my blend file. I'm using what we call the materials.xml. This automatically references the textures, and we don't need to do it in Blender itself, as when we build the model, it'll actually automatically get called, and we don't have to set any of that up. It just makes things easier for us, especially if we're using vanilla textures. You can go ahead and use your own materials.xml, but it could get a little bit difficult, and I'll probably end up having to cover a video about that at a later date. So that pretty much wraps up what the Space Engineers project folder is. If you want some other inspiration or example of what this folder would look like if it had a whole bunch of stuff in it, what you can do is you can go to where you have Space Engineers installed. So for me, it's under Local Disk C, Games, Steam, Steam Apps, Common, and then you go into Space Engineers, and then you go into Content, and then here we are with all of our folders for all of our art assets and other stuff. As you can see, we have the Models folder and the Textures folder. Going into the Textures folder, you can again see that we have some extra files and extra folders. But again, you can see the Models folder. Going into that, we can further see what we're looking at here, and then we could see the other separation of cubes again. We go in there, we could see all of the vanilla textures that are available to us. The reason you see all these PS is because I use Photoshop to open them. Photoshop is the only program right now that can open and edit the BC7 DDS texture type. You are able to convert from the BC7 to something you can use in GIMP and then convert back to this BC7 format. I'll cover that in a video later on. Going back, we'll go ahead and check out the Models folder. Going into the Models folder, you can see that there's no extra files in here, and ideally that's how you'll have it set up in your mod. Go into the cubes. You can see that they have it separated by large and small. I don't do that, but you can if you want. Going into the large, we can see a whole bunch of Mwm files, but we don't see any of those text files or XMLs like in the folder that we were looking at in our projects folder. This is because this is the final output of what we actually need, and this is what the game uses. You don't need to have the XMLs, you don't need to have the HKTs or those text files in your mod. If you have them in your mod, it's just making it a little bit bigger than it needs to be. So I suggest making sure that when you do create your mod, you don't have any of those in there. And I'll go into that in further detail in a future video when we're actually working on creating a mod. For now, we're just setting up the folder and looking at some examples. So we're going to go back to the storage drive, and here we can see I have the 3D projects folder. We have the 3 folders that are important to us: the Blender plugins, renders, and Space Engineers. Going into the Space Engineers folder, we can see we have our models and our textures. If you ever need inspiration or need to follow the vanilla file path, just go to the game folder like I showed you, and you should be able to find plenty of examples in there on how your folder should be structured. And that pretty much wraps up this project folder setup video. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, feel free to send me a message and I'll usually get back to you fairly quick. If you like these tutorial videos and would like to see them or other types of videos more regularly, be sure to check out my Patreon. As a thanks for helping me out, I'll try to keep my patrons updated about what's going on and try to provide any support to any that need it. That's all for now. Take care.